Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to see all of you. Thank you for being part of this. We're going to go ahead and get started. Today, as you may know or have already figured out, if you didn't already know, is St. Peter's Day, which is our annual celebration of our patron saint, the apostle for whom we are named. So I wanted us to take just a few minutes this morning and focus on Peter and think about him and hopefully have some conversation about him and about what we know and maybe some of what we don't know. But let's begin by praying this prayer together. Almighty Father, who inspired Simon Peter, first among the apostles, to confess Jesus as Messiah and Son of the living God, keep your church steadfast upon the rock of this faith, so that in unity and peace we may proclaim the one truth and follow the one Lord, our Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. So Jay Kanzler is the preacher today, and I asked him if I could borrow the first page of his sermon because I like the way that he started off, and I want to just share with you what you have already heard if you've went to the 8 o'clock service and what you'll hear in a few minutes at the 10:30. It is St. Peter's Day, and therefore it is right that we should have a gospel reading focused on Peter, which Jay identifies as being his favorite apostle. And as you will hear, and as you'll see in a few minutes, our gospel lesson today is one that focuses on him. I love Peter because he's more like me in his faults and failings than any other disciple. And I resonated with that because I think that's part of how I've always kind of looked at Peter as someone who, as we'll talk about in a minute, had some faults and failings. Peter's heart always seems to be in the right place, and even though he often gets it wrong, he keeps plugging along. Jesus singles him out as the rock upon which his church will be built. As a church, we can be very proud of our namesake, Simon Peter, son of John. Thank you, Jay. So before I talk anymore, I hope this can be as much a conversation as anything today. I'd like to just hear, as you may have noticed on this title slide, I kind of wanted us to do a who, what, when, where of Peter. So I want to just begin, and remember, Nathan will need to bring you. Nathan, good grief. Connor will need to bring you the microphone, but I'd just like to get some feedback from you. What do you know about Peter? And it can be anything, and please go into as much detail as you choose to. When you hear Peter, and when you think about Saint Peter, what do you think about, and what do you know about him?
I know he was a fisherman, and there's a statue of him on the very top of Exeter Cathedral in England, and he is completely naked, carrying the keys of heaven and dragging his fishing nets behind him.
Thank you, Catherine. I didn't. We're going to actually read about that in just a moment. I didn't know that statue was of him being naked. What else? What else do you know about Peter?
The rock.
Tim?
The rock upon which I will build my church.
Okay.
And that he denied Christ 3 times.
Okay.
Those 2 high points are pretty much what we know. Okay.
So the rock upon which Jesus said he would build the church, and
that he denied Christ
3
times.
Christ. Okay.
But then to follow on that, when Jesus confronts him about that, he says, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. And he made him say it 3 times. So I also find that beautiful because it was an opportunity for reconciliation appropriate to the betrayal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Oh, come on.
Well, like the painting suggests there, that he was crucified upside down because he didn't want to be crucified the way Jesus was crucified, is my understanding.
Yep. Okay. What else do you know about Peter?
I think he was probably a pretty good politician as well, having to kind of take over the church after Jesus, and that connection between the Jewish community and the Gentile community and building this church from the ground up.
Okay.
Wasn't he like against Jesus at first? And, one of the people who were really against Jesus at first? Or do I have somebody else mixed up?
I think you may be thinking about Paul.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's,
But interestingly, we in either June or July, David sent in, which one is it? June 29th, is the feast of Saint. We observe the feast day. We celebrate Peter and Paul together, and that's right. That's what those are actually the lessons that we're hearing today, and we just, for whatever reason, here at St. Peter's, move it into this time of the year.
For the weather.
That's right. All right. Anything else that you know about Peter?
I'm going to have it a little fuzzy, but I think of Peter as ready, fire, aim. And when Jesus was transfigured on the mountaintop, and then Peter wanted to build these shrines. He's so excited.
Yep. The transfiguration, the story of the transfiguration is what Catherine's referring to. And when Jesus went up on the top of a mountain with Peter and James and John, and his whole appearance changed, and the cloud comes down from heaven and says, "This is my son. Listen to him." And then we're told that they went back down off of the mountain. But it was those three, Peter, James, and John, who were the ones who experienced Jesus in that way, and we believe then helped to identify for us then more of who not only to them but also to us, more of who Jesus was and is.
And was there also with Elijah, and so this may be a different gospel story with Elijah and...
No, that's definitely part of it, and in Peter's way that Jay points out in his sermon, kind of always go, and whatever comes out of his mouth. Part of what we hear in that story is Peter getting really excited about what's happening, and they have this vision of Elijah and Elisha being part of this vision, and then Peter says, "Well, let's build 3 booths here. One for Jesus, one here, and it gets all worked up." Yeah. Which is interesting because it's Peter and not James and John who talk about that and want to do that. All right, anything else? David, send him.
In the introit text for today, we sing about the aftermath of Peter's imprisonment.
Interesting. Can you say any more about that?
Peter was in prison, and then he was freed by an angel. And it meant a lot to him that God freed him from prison.
Yeah. Interesting. Very good. All right. Well, let's look a little bit more deeply into the who, what, when, and where of Peter, and some of this. What you're going to see are things that some of you have already identified. So what we know about Peter is pretty much limited to the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then the Gospel, and then the book of Acts, which is a continuation of the Gospel of Luke, which just moves beyond Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension into then what happened in the formation of the church. So we learn about what Peter did after that in helping to form and to shape the church and to give it what it is now. And then we learn a little bit more about him and looked in the 2 letters that bear his name. So if we get this kind of mix of accounts of who Peter was, and his influence and how he helped to form and shape the church. So if you're wondering, well, so why did I choose to do this today? I just think that it's important to think about and be aware of who it is that we're named for. We were celebrating today, but in many churches, in some churches, the day in which your patron saint is celebrated is huge. It is a very, very significant thing, and that's not to say what we're going to do and what we're doing today is not significant. But I think it's just important to hold up and be reminded of the fact that we are named for someone who was so instrumental in the very reason that why we're here. And not only in helping to support and to be part of the life and the work and the ministry of Jesus, but who then also carried that forward as Jesus asked Peter and the other apostles, the other 11 apostles, to do after he was gone. So what we know is this is what we know of Peter, which means that, this might be very obvious, but what this means is that there's not necessarily a whole lot, if any, other historical writings that tell us much about Peter. What we know about Peter, we get from Holy Scripture. We get from the Bible, and we read a fair amount of this throughout our liturgical, cycles of the 3-year cycles of readings that we have from the Bible. We read a good bit and learn more about, and have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about Peter. We know that he was first named Simon, but Jesus named him Cephas, or Peter, which means rock, and Tim referred to that a moment ago. And then there's a conversation that Peter has with Jesus, in which he identifies him in that way. So this comes from John 1. I'm not going to read a whole lot of scripture to you, but I just want to share a few things. One of the two who heard, this is from the first chapter of John, one of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah." He brought Simon to Jesus, who looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You are to be called Cephas," which is translated Peter. Right? So that's how we look at and recognize his name. Now, someone pointed out that Catherine pointed out that Peter was a fisherman, a Jewish fisherman from a place called Bethsaida, and he was called to be a disciple of Jesus at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. So Peter was someone who, from the beginning, was involved with and interacted with Jesus and helped contribute to not only to his life and work and ministry, but also is someone who would have been, again, one of the eyewitnesses to the various things that Jesus did, said, and then, as we'll see in a few minutes, then he was also one of the eyewitnesses to one of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. This is as you may know, there is a basilica at the Vatican, the statue of St. Peter's. And this is a statue that's in St. Peter's Basilica. We know that his name appears over 180 times. We don't have any knowledge of him prior to his conversion and his willingness to follow Jesus, other than, as Catherine pointed out, that he was a fisherman. He was kind of just doing his thing along the Sea of Galilee, which is where most of the ministry of Jesus took place. And then Jesus, called him to be one of his disciples. As Jay has alluded to, he's someone who is portrayed as a person with great strength, as Jesus identifies when he says, you're the rock, and it is upon you that I'm going to build the church. But also as somebody who had significant weaknesses, fallible, impetuous. Catherine's pointed out his what he did and said, the way he reacted to what he and James and John experienced up on the top of the mountain. And so I think what struck me about what Jay was saying this morning and what Jay says this morning in his sermon is that he really is, I think he can help us identify not only with his very humanness, but also with the humanity of Jesus. And that it was somebody like Peter and others who were those who Jesus called to be the ones who would then carry out what he was doing, what he was trying to bring into the world after his death and resurrection. So I think, as I said, as Jay points out, Peter is somebody that we ought to all, I think, in one way be able to identify with. Not all of us Kathy was bringing up Paul and his, persecution of Christians and the way that he, helped to actually even carry out some of the executions of Christians. That's probably a little bit more difficult for some of us to identify with than it is for us to be able to identify with somebody who was, at times weak and fallible and impetuous and compulsive and whatever, as Peter seems to be. But then what we know, in spite of all of his weaknesses and his very the strong sense of humanity that comes through, we know and we see and we read over and over again that Peter was a leader. Peter was a strong leader of not only of the apostles in the formation of that group, but also then of what became the church. And remember that that when Jesus called Peter and the other disciples to follow him, there was no church, right? There were no Christians. They began to be labeled as followers of the way. But there were no Christians. There was no organization. There were no bishops, priests, deacons. There was no buildings, nothing. And so, what Peter was asked to do was to just become part of this movement, whatever that movement was, and whatever they felt so compelled, however strongly they felt compelled to follow this movement. And then what we also know is that then he became someone who was so taken by what he, again, saw and experienced and heard of Jesus and of what Jesus said and the things that Jesus did, that he became this very devoted witness later on to Jesus. In 1 Corinthians, there's a reference to him being married and his wife accompanying him on some of his missionary journeys, which obviously were things that took place after the resurrection of Jesus, when he was traveling and going to different places and talking to people and trying to say, look, let me tell you what I've experienced and what I and others have seen. And so we know that about him, but we don't know, we just don't know much more detail about Peter, because that's just not part of how things were written at that time. We don't have, as I've said hundreds of times, if you tried if you started writing the Bible today with especially the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, about the life of Jesus with the amount of detail that's in there, it probably wouldn't sell. It just wouldn't, because we demand and want more than is there. And so there's only a certain amount that there's only a certain amount of information that we have. We see Peter being named first and included in all lists of the 12 disciples or apostles. And the differentiation, as you may know, which is somewhat significant but not imperative, is that there were 12 apostles, those who formed the inner circle, the leadership team. They were in the C-suite, what we would refer to now. And then there were those who began to follow Jesus and became disciples of Jesus, as there were people who became disciples of and followed other teachers or other rabbis. So sometimes the term disciple and apostles are used interchangeably, but the apostles were the 12 who then became 11 after Judas betrayed Jesus, and then he was of course replaced. But the 12 apostles. So the Gospels agree that Peter was called at the very beginning of the ministry of Jesus, but where and when is recorded differently in the several Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree that the event took place at the Sea of Galilee. Now, does the term synoptic Gospels ring a bell with you? Okay, so the synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you read, and there are different, in those three Gospels, there are many of the same things, many of the same stories, many of the same accounts of what Jesus did and said, and et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, which is its own unique animal. And even though it ultimately points to what Matthew, Mark, and Luke are trying to point to, which is the death and resurrection of Jesus, which is really the whole point of Matthew, Mark, and Luke writing what they wrote was to get there. Was to get to death and resurrection. That's why there's not as many details. So when we hear the term synoptic Gospels, it refers to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And even though Matthew is placed first in the New Testament, among the New Testament Gospels, it's widely felt that Mark was probably the first Gospel that was written. So in the three synoptic Gospels, they agree that the calling of Peter took place at the Sea of Galilee. And that would probably make sense, again, because of the fact that what we're able to glean from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and even from John to some degree, is that most of what Jesus did, Jesus didn't venture very far from home. Okay? Most of what he did revolved around that body of water called the Sea of Galilee, which was a place where there were and still are small villages, small little towns that all center around this body of water. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we hear about different things that happened in and around the Sea of Galilee. How many of you have been to Israel, to the Holy Land? So if you haven't, then I strongly encourage you to go. But the Sea of Galilee is a very unique place, and now today around the Sea of Galilee are a number of chapels and places that have been built that help to mark different and significant events in the life of Jesus and various things that happened along the way. John's Gospel says that Andrew brought Peter to Jesus and was the one who said to Peter, okay, this one is it. This is what we've been waiting for. This is the Messiah. Remember, all of these people were Jews, okay? They were all Jews. They were all waiting for the Messiah, which ended up being nothing like Jesus, okay? Nothing like Jesus. So even though this is not written that way, when somebody like Andrew would have brought Peter to Jesus, brought Peter to Jesus, said, this is the Messiah, this is it. What it would have been really interesting to see what Peter's reaction would have been, because what they were expecting was somebody who was going to come in as riding the white horse, the white knight on a white horse, who was going to free them from all of the bondage and oppression and violence that they had experienced over the decades, and what Jesus was not that at all. Okay. We've talked about that the first one, the gospel according to John, prefers Simon in terms when referring to Peter. 17 times it's used, or the compound rarely found anywhere else of Simon Peter. So when you hear Simon Peter, that is referring to our Peter, our Saint Peter. And then at solemn moments, Peter is referred to as being Simon, son of John. So let me read just a little bit to you of one of these solemn moments. And this is one of the post-resurrection appearances. Jesus showed himself again to the disciples in this way. Gathering there together were Simon Peter, and then he goes on to list some of the others. And Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. And they said to him, we will go with you. And they went out and got into the boat, but they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, children, you have no fish, have you? And they answered him, no. He said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. And so they cast it out, and now they were able to haul it in because there were so many fish. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked. Remember, Catherine referred to the statue that's on the cathedral in Exeter. He was naked and jumped into the lake. I've always thought that was, of all the lack of details, why that detail was put in there, I have no idea. Nathan, have you ever done any research, or Jay, any idea what the nakedness had to do? Yeah, okay. It was probably hot, yeah. But the other disciples came into the boat dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. And when they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. And Jesus said, bring some of the fish you've caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them, though there were so many that the net was not torn. So that's another place and way in which we hear about Jesus referring to Simon and being in conversation with him at one of the more what's called, referred to as one of the more solemn moments. All right, so again, in different ways, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, agree that Peter was the spokesperson for the group, and it's felt that he was somewhat elevated to a little different status maybe than the other 11. Again, as Jay kind of refers to, there were times when he was vacillating and unsure. And as in his relations with the church of Antioch, and this would of course been later on after death and resurrection, when he was beginning to go out and talk about and try to relate to these groups of people that were beginning to form what would become the church. And then when he first ate with the Gentiles, and then later refused then to eat with the Gentiles. So there was this kind of this back and forth vacillating that came out of his own Jewishness and out of his own sense of trying to discern what it was that Jesus had actually called them to do and was asking them to do. So I think the most important thing is the fact that he, that just like us, or just especially like me, sometimes you vacillate, sometimes you're unsure, sometimes you doubt, sometimes you don't have as much faith. I mean, it's just a very, he comes across as being very human. There were times when he is depicted as rash, hasty, irritable, and capable of great anger. And then on the other hand, there's times when he's pictured as being gentle and firm, as in his professions of love to Jesus. And also, was able to portray this great sense of loyalty to Jesus, this great sense of love to Jesus. I think Catherine or somebody referred to, how he said he identified Jesus and said, you are it, you are the Christ. But then later on in his kind of vacillating and uncertainty, and then probably out of fear, ends up denying that he even knew Jesus, but then comes back later on to fully embrace Jesus again. I think someone mentioned that we see how he goes out into the deep water. And let down their nets for a catch. That comes from in Luke's gospel. And then Jesus says to them after Jesus says, I know you've been fishing all night, but put your nets back in. And they do that, and the nets come up full of fish. And Jesus says, okay, this is what I've been trying to tell you. From now on, you're going to fish for people and not just for fish. In Matthew, somebody did mention this. We hear how Peter offered to walk to Jesus on the water. And this was a story from the Sea of Galilee, when we hear about how Peter gets out of the boat, and he's so full of himself. Yes, I'm coming to you, Jesus. And now I know that I recognize who you are. And then as soon as he steps out of the boat and gets into the water, he's like, oh, and loses his faith and doubts, and then begins to sink. And then the story is that Jesus then saves him. Here's another image of that denial when Peter is Jesus is beginning to be going through his passion, and Peter after Jesus has already said to him, "You're going to deny me," and Peter says, "No, I would never do that." And then we know that is what happened. Peter is the one who helps give us some guidance on forgiveness. He asked Jesus how many times you should forgive someone, as many as seven times. And Jesus' response is, no, not that many, but 77 times. And so the point being that that forgiveness is something that we should continue to offer, and as we try to move toward being reconciled to those who may have wronged us. When this next bullet is referred to as the confession of Peter, when Jesus asks his disciples, starts by asking them one of two questions. The first is, well, who are people saying that I am? And some of them say, well, they think he's maybe a great prophet, you're Elisha, you're Elijah, whatever. And then he says, well, who do you say that I am? And then Peter, in his Peter way, jumps in with response by saying that, again, you're the one. You're the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God. And with that, then, Jesus says, okay, Peter, it's around you that I will then build this church. And the gates of Hades, there's nothing that's going to get in the way of that. Now, in the Roman Catholic tradition, it's felt like that from that point, then Peter became the first pope. And that every pope since then has been in succession of Peter. Now, those in the much more Protestant tradition than we are obviously don't necessarily agree with that, and prefer to look at it as Jesus saying that there's going to be something that's going to be more than what as I leave, and this, and we're building upon. You're following me, and you doing what I'm asking you to do is building on that. So not necessarily the direct connection between the papacy. And then Jesus goes on to say to Peter, that I will give you the keys to the kingdom, and that whatever is bound on earth and bound in heaven will be bound in heaven. Whatever is loosed on earth will be loosed in heaven. And this is the depiction that's in the Sistine Chapel of the delivery of the keys. And of course, this would be very much in keeping with the tradition of Peter becoming the first pope. So after Jesus' death and resurrection, we hear about Peter trying to work to open up the church to those who were not Jews, to those like us who would not have been part of that faith tradition. And in Acts, we hear about there being a man named Cornelius in Caesarea. And Peter ends up having a vision and then having conversations with this man Cornelius. And in this vision, Peter is able to see how basically what it involves is Peter being able to have a greater understanding that it's not about ritual purification. That everybody doesn't have to be ritually pure to be able to relate to and have a relationship with God. And then finally, someone referenced this a while ago. There's no information in the Bible about how Peter died or what happened, but tradition has it that he was probably martyred in Rome, and that he was crucified head down at his own request, so that he would not be crucified in the same way that Jesus died. All right, Rich. Hold on.
I'm trying to put all of this into some kind of context, I guess, historically. Let's say post-resurrection, post-ascension, between that point in time and the martyring of Peter, how long was he in charge, I guess? How many years? Do we have any idea how long that was? And I guess what I'm leading up to is, do we have any, other than, I guess, opening the movement up to Gentiles, which seems pretty important.
Yeah.
What other things did he do that fundamentally shaped what was to become the church? It's hard for me I'm just trying to figure out why he is. I get that he's important,
Yeah.
okay, but why?
Yeah.
That's what I'm asking.
Okay. You have any thoughts or comments about
I
that?
was going to say 20 to 30 years, and fundamentally why, he was also, I'd say 20 to 30 years, although I don't know why that number sticks in my head. And then, because I think they were rather young, probably in their 20s when they started. And then in terms of what he did, remember, he's left behind also in Jerusalem and trying to keep this church not only growing, but from being, torn apart or, by not only, Rome, but by the Jewish authorities. And I think he was that. He was trying to walk that line of, well, we're enough Jewish so that you shouldn't, be afraid of us, but we're also a little different. I think that was important at the time.
I don't know if it's, hello, it says low. I was thinking of a theological point, not political, and I thought back to why would Peter be naked? And so no, seriously, I'm a gynecologist, I think about these things. So, to me, though, in all seriousness, I go back to the Garden of Eden, and when Adam and Eve realize that they are naked, they are ashamed. And so speaking to Peter being naked or catching fish, or later Jesus eating fish with the disciples, to me theologically represents that Jesus wasn't just spiritually resurrected, it was truly physical resurrection. And that fullness of humanity being incorporated, pun intended, incorporated into the resurrection and redemption is where I see Peter being an emphasis.
So, timeline, I'm not as clear on that. I think 20 to 30 would have been my guess. Maybe 40. Looks like maybe Nathan has a thought about that.
His martyrdom happened during the reign of Nero, so people place his martyrdom at 64 AD for when it happened.
Okay. So, and I think to your question about significance, I think that you know a lot of that a lot of that is speculation, but a great deal of it has to do, I think, with what we hear at the end of Matthew's gospel, is what is referred to as the Great Commission. When Jesus was ascending, and he said basically, you know, I want you to go and do what I've been doing, and to do that in my name, and to baptize people, and to let people know who I am. And that's what we see Peter doing after that. And his real significance comes into being able then to kind of open up the way to those who were not Jewish. And to be able to say, yes, you too can be part of this. And again, this vision that allowed him to be able to get past, well, you have to be a Jew, you have to be ritually pure to be able to, you know, be in direct relationship with God, then opened his being able to get past that, then enabled him to be able to create and help to create what we now know as the church, which again obviously went beyond Jews. Okay. Other questions, comments? Well, a little heavier than what we usually do in here, but I thought it was important for us to think about Peter and about who he is and his life and the significance of our being named for him. And so as we, you know, celebrate and give thanks to God today for this church, then I hope we can always be shaped and formed and have part of what we think and do and say as people who say we're part of St. Peter's. You know, continue to be influenced by him. And when I did, and I don't want to give away the entire sermon, but one of the things that Jay says at the end in connection with the gospel reading for today about when the conversation that Jesus was having with Peter about, you know, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, is again, I think, part of who we're called to be, is to go out, as Jay will say, beyond ourselves. And we're working now to think about and work through how we can do that in a more effective way. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you.